January 6th. You realize this is a huge day for people all over this world, because this is Epiphany. Just so happens that Epiphany this time actually lands on a Sunday, but Epiphany for most Christians in this world falls on January 6th, sorry. But it's not a word, it's not a thing that a lot of times in our churches we make a big deal out of, and we look at others who make a big deal out of it, and we wonder why, what's the whole point. So I thought we would first start out today by talking a little bit about Epiphany and what is it. If you'll look it up, of course I Googled it, and you can find all sorts of definitions, but this is basically it. It's a Christian festival observed on January 6th, commemorating the manifestation of Christ to the Gentiles in the person of the Magi. Now it's interesting because we have actually, in the English language, we've actually kind of adopted this word. And if I said, what is an epiphany? Most of us would say, oh, well, it's a sudden realization or something like that. Well, it's interesting because this word, the epiphany, was actually used as a Christian celebration to describe this Christian celebration long before it was ever used to describe a sudden realization. But it came to be defined that way because that's what it's celebrating. It's commemorating the sudden realization of this amazing, amazing thing that God has done. Now you say, well, who exactly celebrates Epiphany? Okay, how many of us grew up in churches where we celebrated Epiphany? See, look at there. 8 of us. There we go. But here's the question. Who exactly celebrates Epiphany? Eastern Orthodox Christians, Russian Orthodox Christians, which some would say are the same thing, Greek Orthodox Christians, which are also Eastern Orthodox, Roman Catholic Christians, Anglican Christians, Protestant Christians. Do you notice there's a common theme going on here? Christians all over the world. And in fact, in a lot of countries, this day is bigger than Christmas. Did you know that? January 6th is actually celebrated more in many, many countries and many, many traditions. More so than Christmas itself. You say, well, why? Why do people go to all this length? For example, in Bulgaria, they do this horo dance in the ice-cold water on the Theophany, which is another way of saying Epiphany. I, for one, I'm kind of glad that I'm not a Bulgarian Christian, because me and cold water, I don't know. I'm not that big. In Australia and in many, many countries, on this day, on Theophany or Epiphany, they also do the blessings of the water, because in addition to this Epiphany of the Magi presenting their gifts to Jesus and Jesus manifesting himself to the Gentiles, they also, in some traditions, celebrate the baptism of Jesus, because this was also an epiphany. This is when he was first recognized, or some would say first recognized as the Messiah. And anyway, so there's a lot of different traditions. He's throwing a cross out into the water here. But here's the question for us today. What's the point? What should you and I take away from Epiphany today? Well, in my studying of it, I want to share with you what I am taking away from Epiphany, and why I believe it is something that we need to think about and need to celebrate. The story that we take, there's quite a few of the Gospels that actually talk about the Magi, but Matthew talks about it. This is the one I'm choosing for us to look at. And it says simply this: after Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, "Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star, and when it rose, and we have come to worship him." Now, as the story goes, it was very surprising to Herod, and he was afraid, it said. He was actually afraid. But here's the question that comes to our minds. What do we know about these Magi guys? Okay? We call them Magi, which we actually, the same word that's used for Magi here is, we end up using it as magician. Okay? But this could be translated as wise men. For some reason, a lot of times we think of them as kings. Not necessarily borne out in the text that they were royalty per se. Some have said they could have been astronomers because they looked at the stars and all this kind of stuff. But it does beg the question, these guys from the east, where is the east? Well, everything east of Israel, there was a lot of east, okay? Where exactly were they from? Some have actually said that it is possible, but that these were from Persia, that had been Babylon, and that at one point, Daniel, who had been put in charge of all the wise men in Babylon, had remained faithful to God, and we know that, we postulate that possibly Daniel had taught the prophecies of the Messiah to the wise men in Babylon. And that it had been passed down and passed down and passed down and passed down. And here we go. These guys struck out from wherever they were, possibly Persia. But we don't know that that's the case. We really don't. But we do know this. They were Gentiles. They were not Jews. Now, everyone else in the Christmas story were Jews. Mary, Joseph, maybe even the sheep and the shepherds, because they were all from right there. But here we have Gentiles. Now, at this time, the Jews looked at, if you weren't a Jew, you were a Gentile, right? If you weren't one of God's chosen people, then you fell into this category. You were a Gentile. So, this signals something pretty radical, pretty amazing. And the fact that Matthew, who most consider Matthew having written his gospel to the Jews, Matthew was a Jew, and he wanted his people to understand who Jesus was, that he was the Messiah. But he didn't just say, hey, he's the Messiah for us. Come on, guys. He wants them to understand. He included the Magi in his telling of the story because they were there, for one thing, but also because this is a key part of the Messiah. This is a new thing. Up until this time, it was God and his people. God and his people. Yahweh and the Israelites. But here we go. Something incredible. With the coming of the Messiah, God says it's about more than just the Gentiles. What else do we know about the Magi? Well, they go and they talk to Herod. It kind of concerns Herod, all that kind of stuff. Herod ends up asking them to come back and talk to him about when exactly did the star first appear and all this kind of stuff. Herod ends up using what they told him to decide to go and kill all the children under age 2 in Bethlehem. But at any rate, after he had talked to them, they left. He said, hey, I want y'all to come back. I want y'all to come back and tell me where the child is, quote, so I can go worship him. It says, after they had heard the king, they went on their way, and the star they had seen when it rose went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were overjoyed. And on coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshipped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold and frankincense and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route. Okay, some things in this text. They bowed down and worshipped him. You may bow down in the presence of royalty. You may bow down to a king and all of this kind of stuff. But to bow down and worship, it's pretty incredible. And it gives us a clue that these guys, for whatever reason and however they came to understand it, they had an understanding that this Messiah was God. I believe that's what we're kind of getting at here. That this Messiah was God. This was a big deal. And so these Gentiles bowed down and worshiped. And then they brought these treasures. Now we could just say these treasures, they were valuable, and these were another way of paying homage and worshiping him. But we could go into why these are so significant. Each gift had its own significance, and I want to encourage you to go and look at why these gifts are significant, why each one meant something. Whether they understood fully what it meant when they were giving each one, who knows? But here's another thing we see. They returned to their country by another route. In essence, they said, I know what Herod, the king of this land, says, but we're not going to listen to him. We're going to go by a different route. So what do you and I take away from Epiphany? What is that supposed to mean for us today? Let me share with you what I'm taking away. First off, we are Gentiles. Most of us didn't grow up with a Jewish heritage whatsoever. But in the New Testament, Israel is redefined. God's people, the definition used for God's people has been changed by what happened with this little baby, with what happened on the cross. Now, all who put their faith in Christ and are baptized into Christ, we are the new Jerusalem. We are the new Israel. We have been given the right to be called children of God. The whole world, that's who he came for. No matter who someone is, no matter where they've been, no matter where they come from, Jesus came for them. Here's the thing. Do we really act like that's the reality? Do we live that out? This last year, did you live out your life as if Jesus came for every person? Every person you meet in the grocery store, your next door neighbor, the people in other countries, the people who think differently, that live differently, that act differently than we. Jesus died. Jesus came and died for them. We are Gentiles, just like them. And Jesus died for us. And Jesus died for them. And that's something that I need to remember. Jesus is for everybody. Can we say that? Jesus is for everybody. If Epiphany does nothing else, if we can walk out of here remembering that. And I think this is significant, that they took a different route. they, you could say, put their own life at risk. If Herod would have found out that they were leaving by a different route and he could have chased them down, I have no doubt, if he's willing to kill 2-year-old children and order that 2-year-old children unless be killed, then I have no doubt that he would have gladly killed these guys. These guys, because they had been warned in a dream, because they believed who they saw Jesus was, and because they believed the angel that came to them in a dream. And we talked about how many of us trust in dreams. You know, it's kind of hard. But you know what? They took a different route. And I guess those words, they took a different route, are kind of burned into me after studying this week on this. Folks, we just had what we called a different kind of Christmas. And I'm so proud of this congregation to be a part of it because, it ends up being about $14,000 was given because we had a different kind of Christmas and chose to give instead of spending this past Christmas. Well, folks, just like they took a different route, I wonder if we could think about this year taking a different route. Now, the easiest thing for us to do is to continue doing exactly what we've been doing. Whatever that is for you. But what if God is calling us? And every one of us, I imagine the call is a little bit different for every one of us. But I believe He's calling us to something different. Now, you say, well, gosh, you're making a big assumption there, aren't you, preacher? Why do you don't even know what all I'm doing. How in the world could you say God's calling you to something different? Well, here's what I know. I believe He's working on us all, and that and most of us haven't gotten to where we can hear Him perfectly and then have the faith to do exactly what He says every day. If I ask for a show of hands of how many of you fall into that category, I don't know how many hands would go up. Mine wouldn't go up. Because I do believe with my whole heart that I miss the boat. I miss out. Because I'm hard-headed, and sometimes my ears don't work real well. My wife just said amen to herself just then. But folks, what if this year, God said, hey, I want you to take a different route. I want you to do something different. I want you to be somebody different this year than you've ever been before. I want you to take a trip to a place you've never been before. I want you to do things at your church that you've never done before. I want you to take a different route. How are we going to respond to that? I hope that this year, you and I will have an epiphany where God is manifest to us in a whole new way. And that because of what God's doing, we go a different direction. In God's will. That's my hope and my prayer for us. Tom, if you guys could come on back.